As I boarded my flight, my ex-husband was at a jewelry store with his mistress, telling her, "Buy whatever you want. My wife's inheritance is ours now." He didn't know that as he swiped the card, the clerk would say. The morning I destroyed my husband's life, I had a medium black coffee, no sugar, and I wore the same white cashmere sweater I'd worn to my father's funeral. I remember that detail because Mark had made a face at the sweater that morning, that specific micro expression of distaste he had spent 10 years perfecting, and said, "Don't you think it's a bit much? Wearing grief like an accessory?" I said nothing. I folded my boarding pass in half and tucked it into the front pocket of my carry-on. Gate B7, JFK to London Heathrow, one way. At that exact moment, 40 blocks south of where I was standing, Mark Reynolds was waving a manicured hand at a glass display case on the ground floor of the Tiffany & Coder flagship store on Fifth Avenue, telling a woman named Tiffany Vance, yes, her actual name, the universe has a brutal sense of irony, "Buy whatever you want, babe. My wife's inheritance is finally ours." He placed a heavy matte black metal card on the velvet tray. He had never looked more confident in his life. He had exactly 10 minutes left before that confidence became the most expensive feeling he'd ever allowed himself. To understand the precision of what happened in that store, you have to understand the decade that made it necessary. I was Sarah Miller before I became Sarah Reynolds, and I was a completely different person. I had a studio in Williamsburg covered floor to ceiling in oil paint. I had a fellowship at the Pratt Institute and opinions about Basquiat and strong coffee and the way afternoon light moved through factory windows. I was, objectively, someone with a shape and a direction, and a self that belonged entirely to her. Then I met Mark at an alumni gala, and he was spectacular in the way that certain men are spectacular, the kind of spectacular that is less a quality and more a weapon. He was Greenwich, Connecticut made human, tall, immaculate, with a laugh that claimed entire rooms and eyes that were always calculating. He told me he loved my creative fire. He said he'd never met anyone like me. He said he wanted to build something real. What he actually meant was, I want access to the trust fund behind the creative fire. My father, Robert Miller, a self-made technology entrepreneur who had grown a small semiconductor firm into a $2 billion enterprise through sheer obstinate intelligence, saw through Mark immediately. He was always polite at dinners. He asked pointed questions about Mark's finances and listened to the answers arrive full of jargon and elegant evasion. And he smiled in the way a surgeon smiles when they already know what the scan shows. He never forbade the marriage. He simply said, once, quietly, standing at his kitchen counter over a glass of 20-year-old scotch, "Sarah, when someone tells you who they are in the first 5 minutes, believe them." I was 29 and certain I knew better. I married Mark 18 months later. Over the next 10 years, I watched my identity compress slowly into the shape Mark required of it. I stopped painting. I started attending charity luncheons and country club galas and managing a social calendar for a household funded entirely by my family's money. Though Mark accepted compliments on our 15,000 square foot Greenwich estate with the pride of a man who had built it with his own hands. His real estate firm ran on my capital, my family name, and my father's network of carefully cultivated introductions. In Greenwich, image is its own currency, and Mark was a masterful counterfeiter. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic ultimatums or flying plates. There was something quieter and worse, a long, slow compression of my selfhood into a shape that fit better beside him. When I mentioned returning to painting, Mark would smile and say, "Of course, sweetheart." Once things settled down at the firm, things never settled. When I brought up starting a family, he said, "Absolutely, when the market stabilizes." The market never did. Every conversation about my life ended in a polite redirection back toward his. I had spent a decade being managed. Then my father got sick, and 11 weeks later, my father died. 3 weeks after the funeral, Mark stood in our marble kitchen and told me my grief was getting exhausting. I want to stay in that moment, because it was the moment everything inside me that had been softly deteriorating finally calcified into something hard and cold and load-bearing. I was holding my father's old Patek Philippe, a scratched, worn thing he'd worn every single day since 1987, its crystal face clouded at the edge. The leather strap, replaced so many times the holes had multiplied. It had arrived from the estate lawyers in a small box with a handwritten note. 6 words, "Keep building, love, Dad." I didn't understand what he meant yet. Mark didn't look up from his phone. He was checking commodity prices, or real estate listings, or messages from someone. I wouldn't learn exactly which until later that night. He adjusted his tie in the dark reflection of the oven glass and said, as if repeating a reasonable business position, "The lawyers are waiting for your signature on the transfer documents. Stop being so emotional and start being a partner." I looked at him for a long moment. I wiped my face. I nodded. I did not sleep that night. Around 2 in the morning, I went to his home office to use the printer. Mark's laptop was open on the desk, screen glowing. He had always been carelessly arrogant with his devices around me, one of many symptoms of the fundamental contempt beneath our marriage. He genuinely did not believe I was paying attention. A single folder sat at the center of his desktop. He had titled it, with staggering confidence, simply, "Exit Strategy." My hands were steady as I clicked it open. My chest was not. Inside was a 63-page document, legal frameworks, financial timelines, annotated with the names of attorneys and financial advisors I didn't recognize. It outlined, step by step, exactly how Mark planned to have me sign my father's $50 million inheritance into a joint family family trust, then immediately file for divorce before I could access independent legal counsel. Because the funds would sit in a shared account, they'd be subject to equitable distribution under Connecticut divorce law. He had a projected settlement figure for what I'd walk away with, $400,000, on a $50 million inheritance. My pulse didn't race, my hands didn't shake. I felt for the first time in 10 years, a clean, terrifying clarity, the kind that arrives when you finally see the shape of something you had been living inside of without recognizing its walls. I closed the laptop, I returned to the guest bedroom, and I dialed a number I knew by heart. Elias, I said, my voice stripped of everything soft. Elias Thorne picked up on the second ring. He is 71 years old, silver-haired, built like an industrial freezer, and he had been my father's estate attorney for 34 years. He has a voice like gravel in a cement mixer, and a legal mind that could quietly dismantle a Fortune 500 company over a long lunch. He had despised Mark Reynolds with a consistent, professional thoroughness he had never bothered to conceal from anyone. "Sarah, my dear," he said, not startled, not even remotely surprised. "It's time," I told him. "I need to trigger the contingency clause. I want to leave him with nothing, Elias. I mean that precisely." A brief silence, then the sound of a man experiencing something very close to satisfaction. "Your father had this clause drafted 3 years ago," Elias said. "I've been waiting. I'll have the decoy documents ready by Sunday morning. You'll need to find the iPad." I already knew about the iPad. I'd seen it sitting in his desk drawer for months. The next morning, while Mark was at one of his breakfast strategy meetings, a fiction I would later have documented, I found the device, powered it on, and discovered he'd forgotten to unsync it from his iCloud account. The messages between him and Tiffany Vance went back 8 months. I will not reproduce most of them, because there is a particular quality to seeing yourself discussed as an obstacle, not as a person, not even as a complication, just as a logistical problem with a pending solution date. She called me the sad one. She asked, repeatedly and without patience, when the money was coming. Mark told her soon, babe, with the confidence of a man who had already spent it in his mind. The message that sealed everything was dated 6 days earlier. "Once she signs Monday, I'm filing Tuesday. She won't have a dime left for a lawyer. We'll have the ring by next weekend." I photographed every screen. I emailed the images to a secure server Elias had set up for exactly this purpose. I returned the iPad to the drawer at the precise angle I'd found it. Then I went to the kitchen and made a full breakfast, because I hadn't properly eaten in 3 weeks, and I had a great deal of work ahead of me. Elias Thorne had 3 decades of my father's legal architecture stored in his memory, and he had, apparently, a talent for producing documents of such precisely legitimate appearance that a man blinded by greed would not think to have them independently verified. Over the next 48 hours, while Mark attended his various cover story appointments, Gerald Park, a former 17-year FBI financial crimes investigator whom Elias retained as a private investigator, confirmed they were exactly that. Elias and his team prepared 2 complete sets of transfer documents. The first set was what Mark expected, papers moving my father's estate into a joint family trust bearing both our names. These were the documents Mark would slide across the desk to me with that particular smile he reserved for closings. The second set was what I actually signed, a binding transfer into an ironclad offshore trust in Zurich, structured under Swiss private banking law, completely insulated from all marital assets and inaccessible to Mark Reynolds under any legal framework in any jurisdiction we were likely to touch. Elias had had this framework prepared and waiting for 3 years on my father's explicit instruction. My father had seen this coming long before I had. He had simply been waiting for me to see it too. The only performance required of me was the performance. On Sunday evening, Mark walked into the study smelling of Tiffany's jasmine perfume, which he had apparently decided was no longer worth hiding, and dropped a stack of documents on the desk with the particular theatrical flair of a man who believed he was moments from winning. He placed a heavy Mont Blanc pen on top. He looked at me with a warmth so practiced it had become almost real and said, "Sign the papers, Sarah. Let's secure our future." I looked at him across the desk. I picked up the pen. There is a very specific kind of calm that comes from looking your executioner in the eye and handing him a gun loaded with blanks. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the papers, which Mark observed with visible satisfaction, interpreting it as the nerves of a woman overwhelmed. What it actually was the physical cost of 10 years of compressed anger locating the precise moment of its release. I signed every page, slowly, deliberately. Mark watched with the barely contained energy of a man who has just been told he's won the lottery and is waiting for the check to clear. What he had actually signed himself up for, by believing me, was the most expensive exercise in confirmation bias of his life. His arrogance was the mechanism. He had wanted me to be financially illiterate and emotionally compromised, so that is what he saw, because that is what he needed to see. He never verified a single document with an independent attorney. He never called the bank to confirm the transfer structure. He believed because believing was profitable. The moment Mark left the study, exhaling with the audible relief of a man who considers the hard part over, I sat alone for exactly 4 minutes. Then I went upstairs and began the quiet work of packing 3 suitcases. For the next 5 days, Mark's hubris swelled to a scale that would have been almost impressive to observe from a distance. Certain the $50 million would hit their joint accounts by Friday, he took out substantial bridge loans against his own real estate firm. Gerald Park documented the transaction transactions as they occurred, funding non-refundable deposits on a penthouse in Tribeca, private jet charters, custom bespoke suits, and a trip to a jeweler in Midtown to preview rings. He was, with extravagant precision, digging his own grave with a gold-plated shovel. The peak of his delusion came at the Greenwich Country Club's annual spring gala, 4 days before my flight. Mark stood in the center of the room with a glass of Macallan in one hand and his other hand resting a few inches too low on Tiffany Vance's back, in full view of everyone who had ever attended one of our dinner parties, and smiled across our table. "To new beginnings," he said, voice booming with the unearned authority of a man who has already mentally moved into someone else's apartment. "My wife has finally seen the light. We're expanding the Reynolds portfolio in a major way. Massive things are coming." Several of the women in the room exchanged glances, the specific glances that happen when something true is visible to everyone in the room except the person it concerns most. The Greenwich Code of Silence held as it always does. "Yes," I said from 3 feet away, my voice quiet enough to require the room to settle to hear it. "Bigger than you can possibly imagine, Mark. I've made sure everything is exactly where it belongs." He grinned and patted my shoulder like I was a golden retriever that had performed a trick on command. I smiled back. It was the sharpest thing I owned. The night before my flight, I lay in the guest bedroom listening to him sleep down the hall, his confidence so complete it allowed him to sleep deeply and without apparent conscience. Everything was in place. Gerald Park was positioned, the accounts were primed, the attorneys were on standby. Elias had filed the emergency motion with a Connecticut state court judge, the Honorable Patricia O.C. Mensah, 22 years on the bench, who had reviewed the exit strategy document, the photographed messages, and the evidence of financial coercion, and had signed the restraining order at 9:30 the previous evening. At 6 a.m., I carried 3 suitcases to a black car idling in the driveway. Before I left the master suite for the last time, I placed 2 items on the center of Mark's perfectly made side of the bed. The first was an empty velvet Tiffany & Co. jewelry box. The second was a sleek black folder that looked exactly like a bank confirmation document. Inside it was a certified copy of the restraining order, the divorce filing, and a 1-page letter I had written myself, 3 sentences long, which I will not reproduce here. He would read it around noon. He would read it alone. By 9:45 a.m., I was seated in the first-class lounge at JFK, watching the tarmac through the floor-to-ceiling windows, my heart keeping a specific, anticipatory rhythm against my ribs. Gerald Park's updates arrived by encrypted message every few minutes. 9:50 a.m. Subject and companion entered Tiffany & Carter flagship 5th Avenue. Subject is being characteristically loud. I ordered a second coffee. 9:56 a.m. Subject is at the main display counter. Companion has selected a yellow diamond ring. Estimate value $340,000. 9:58 a.m. Subject has produced the card, requesting transaction. I watched the digital clock on my phone. 60 seconds, 30, 10. At exactly 10 shower a.m., I sent a single one-word text to Elias Thorne. Execute. In the next 60 seconds, a financial guillotine dropped across every account bearing both our names. Elias's team at Whitmore, Thorne & Associates moved with a precision that 34 years of preparation tends to produce. Every joint account was permanently closed. All secondary credit cards attached to my name were instantly revoked and flagged. A court-mandated freeze locked Mark entirely out of the Greenwich estate. The locks had been changed at 8 hours a.m. Gerald Park had confirmed they were changed correctly. On 5th Avenue, Mark Reynolds leaned against the polished glass counter with the physical confidence of a man who has never in his life experienced a declined transaction. He pointed at the yellow diamond ring with the casual authority of someone ordering from a menu they've already memorized. "We'll take that one," he said. He picked up the black card and slid it across the velvet tray with a small theatrical flourish. Tiffany pressed herself against his arm and made the sound of a woman who believed her future had just been purchased. The sales associate, a poised 26-year veteran of that store named Dennis Huang, whom Gerald Park had quietly briefed 40 minutes earlier, picked up the card and ran it through the terminal. A red light, a sharp, hollow beep. Dennis frowned with careful, professional neutrality and tried again. Another beep. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reynolds," Dennis said. "The transaction has been declined." Mark laughed. It was the laugh of a man who cannot yet access the correct interpretation of events. "Try it again, buddy. I moved $50 million this morning. The system is probably catching up." Dennis typed something into his screen. He looked at the monitor for a long moment. The polite retail expression he had maintained professionally for 26 years did not slip so much as it was simply replaced with something cooler and more absolute. "Sir," Dennis said, his voice lowered to the precise register that ensures nearby people lean in while the intended recipient feels acutely exposed. "I'm receiving a high-priority system alert on this account. It was closed by the primary account holder approximately 10 minutes ago." He paused. "There is also a fraud flag on your name from the issuing bank." Another pause. "I've been instructed to retain this card." Dennis Huang picked up the black card. He placed it in a lockbox beneath the counter, and the lockbox made a small, definitive click. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then, Mark Reynolds began to shout. He demanded the manager. He demanded his bank. He cycled through the name-dropping that had worked in rooms like this for his entire adult life. He went red in the face in the specific specific way of a man whose access to power has just been revoked and who cannot yet believe the revocation is permanent. Store security. Two large men in dark suits who had also been quietly briefed began moving toward the counter from opposite sides of the room. Tiffany Vance backed away from him. She looked at the empty velvet tray. She looked at the two security guards. She looked at Mark, red-faced and shouting, the elegant performance of his life finally abandoning him entirely. She took out her phone and called a cab. At gate B7, my flight was called for boarding. I handed my passport to the attendant, walked down the jet bridge, and settled into my seat by the window. The plane pushed back from the gate, the engines built to a steady roar. I watched the geometry of the airport recede. I took out my phone to switch it to airplane mode. Before I did, one final notification lit the screen. An encrypted message from Elias Thorne. Wire transfer of $50,000 to Zurich Trust successful. Have a good flight, Ms. Miller. I turned the phone off. I watched the ground fall away, and for the first time in 10 years, I breathed air that tasted like it was entirely mine. Gravity is a specific kind of punishment for people who built their lives in the air. When Mark finally left Fifth Avenue, without the ring, and shortly without Tiffany, who kissed him once on the cheek in the cab line and then gave the driver an address on the opposite side of the city, he ordered his driver back to Greenwich. He needed the papers. He needed to fix this. He needed to find the seam in the plan and pull it open. His town car pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the estate at 11:40 a.m. His key code produced a red light on the panel. He climbed out. The pedestrian gate lock had been replaced, and there, arranged in a neat row on the cobblestones of the driveway, were 6 heavy-duty black garbage bags. Inside them, his custom suits, his golf clubs, his collection of luxury watches, his bespoke shoes, his Mont Blanc pen set. Taped to the outermost bag was a certified copy of Judge Osei Mensah's restraining order, signed and stamped, alongside the divorce filing. He was locked out. The accounts were closed, and because of the bridge loans he had cheerfully taken out against his own firm during the previous 5 days, loans he had been certain he would repay the moment $50 million arrived in his accounts, he was nearly $2 million in personal debt, secured against a business that had no liquid assets remaining. The moment Tiffany Vance processed the full picture, no money, no estate, no Tribeca penthouse, and a man whose firm was now drowning in bridge loan debt, her number was disconnected within 48 hours. She moved to a different brokerage firm. She did not return his calls, his emails, or the one handwritten letter Gerald Park documented him dropping at her building. She proved, with admirable efficiency, that she had never been in love with Mark Reynolds. She had been in love with Mark Reynolds' access to my father's money, and that access had lasted approximately as long as the card swipe. Elias Thorne dismantled Mark's legal counterclaims in Connecticut family court over the following 3 months, with the systematic, unhurried pleasure of a man who has been waiting decades for exactly this moment. The exit strategy document was entered as Exhibit A. The photographed messages were Exhibit B. The bridge loan documentation, obtained via court order and showing that Mark had leveraged his own firm against funds he had not yet legally received, was Exhibit C. Judge Osei Mensah heard the full case and ruled accordingly. The divorce decree was signed. Mark was held solely responsible for all personal debts he had incurred during the marriage's final weeks. His counterclaim for a share of the estate was dismissed with prejudice. He appealed. Elias Thorne answered the appeal with a 40-page brief that apparently caused Mark's own attorney to recommend he not pursue the matter further. He did not pursue the matter further. I did not return to Greenwich. I did not watch the fallout in person. When my flight landed at Heathrow, I took a cab not to a 5-star hotel booked under my family name, but to a small, light-filled studio apartment in Chelsea, a property I had purchased in my own name, with my own savings 7 months earlier, when I had begun to understand on some level that this day was coming. I unpacked my 3 suitcases. I bought a cheap coffee maker. I slept for 14 hours. The studio was small enough that the oil paints I'd shipped ahead of time took up an entire corner of the main room, which meant the first thing I saw when I woke up was paint. It felt like finding a part of myself I'd mailed to a safe address before the fire started. I began painting again slowly, the way you begin using an injured limb, carefully, then with increasing confidence, then with a fury I hadn't known I was storing. The work was dark at first, dense, consuming shapes, but there was always a line of light somewhere in the composition, and I didn't plan it. It simply appeared the way honest things do when you finally stop managing them. 6 months after I left, the last confirmed sighting of Mark Reynolds that Gerald Park provided came through a mutual acquaintance visiting New York. She spotted him from a cab window in New Jersey, working as a leasing agent for a strip mall developer. The bespoke suits were gone. An off-the-rack jacket. The chest-out posture he had maintained for 15 years had been completely hollowed out, replaced by the vacant, slightly stunned expression of a man who has discovered, too late, that he was never actually playing the game he thought he was playing. I did not feel satisfaction when I read this. I felt something quieter, relief maybe, closure of a kind that doesn't require witnessing. 1 year after I boarded that flight, the air in London tasted like rain and possibility. I was a working artist. My first solo show at a gallery in Shoreditch had sold out in the opening week. British Vogue had photographed me in front of a large canvas, dense, bruised shapes with a single streak of fierce light cutting through, for a feature on women artists in the second chapter of their careers. The painting was titled The Parasite's Shadow. It had sold for £100,000 before the magazine hit newsstands. I stood on the wrought iron balcony balcony of my studio one evening, looking out over the Thames, holding my father's Patek Philippe. It was ticking steadily against my palm. The water was dark and gold in the last light of the day, and I stood there for a long time, letting myself feel the particular weight of 10 years compressed into 3 suitcases and then released. A substantial portion of the inheritance had gone into a foundation, a thing I had not planned in advance so much as recognized as inevitable. It provided aggressive legal and financial support for women attempting to exit relationships defined by financial coercion. It was staffed by attorneys and financial advisors and advocates who understood that the most effective kind of trap is the one that looks, from the outside, like a life. My father wouldn't have simply wanted me to be rich. He was a man who built things. He would have wanted me to build armor for other people. I had done that. I was doing that. One evening, my assistant, a sharp, relentlessly capable graduate student from the Royal College of Art named Priya, who managed the foundation's administration with a precision that made Elias Thorne compliment her, which was not something Elias did, looked up from her laptop with an expression I didn't immediately recognize. "Sarah," she said carefully, "I need to show you something. We just received a wire transfer to the foundation." "How much?" I asked, wiping charcoal from my thumb. $10 million, Priya said. "It's entirely anonymous, but there's a note attached to the reference." She turned the screen toward me. The note was 6 words. "Your father would be proud. Keep building." I stood very still for a long moment. Priya was watching me, waiting, uncertain of what she was seeing on my face. The watch was ticking in my hand. The Thames moved dark and gold below the balcony. Somewhere in the city, paint was drying on a canvas that had been empty 10 years ago, and a foundation was open, and a door that had been closed was now a door that opened from both sides. I looked at the screen. I looked at those 6 words, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I cried without any particular effort to stop. My father, the original architect of my independence, had left one last room in the building. He had simply been waiting for me to find the door.